Welcome to episode 58 of the World Builder's Anvil. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic, the Erratic Explorers Visit Middle-earth. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Now, you might be wondering why I said Erratic Explorers, and I say that because even though it's just me talking about it, multiple people interact with these things in different ways. And so it's sort of going to be either me talking about, in this case, Middle-earth, or maybe even with other people talking about worlds from fiction or video games that are just interesting and kind of cool. And the idea is not to review and say this world is an A or this world's an F. Anyone who listens to this series know I'm not a huge person on judging. But what I do want to talk about when I talk about a world are things I like about it. Now, let's go over the basics. The basics, when it comes to Middle-earth, are quite simple. This is the 800-pound gorilla of fantasy. If you are in fantasy, you cannot escape comparisons to, negatively or positively, with Middle-earth. You know, the whole idea of medieval fantasy, to the best of my knowledge, really sort of took root in at least modern culture at that time. You know, you did have stuff before there, like with Excalibur, but that was on Earth. Middle-earth was one of the first places that was off-world, but an Earth-like planet. So it's this Earth-like planet that unfortunately very little of it was really ever developed. One small part for four massively important books, or might consider like the Silmarillion massive as well too, but I really consider The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy to be massive. They're the books that most people know about and care about. And so when I go over the basics, it'll be from the way I think about worlds, and I want to talk about why I really like Middle-earth. One are the races. One, you have a huge plethora of races, and I'm not going to list them all off here, but it's humans, dwarfs, elves, ints, orcs, goblins, hobbits, giants, trolls, spiders, everyone's favorite wraiths, and wolves. And I throw wolves in there because wargs are a type of wolf, and they're intelligent, at least in my little mind. No. Maybe I'm just unintelligent. I'm not sure. But the thing I like is there's a variety of races. They're different from each other. There are strengths and weaknesses about them. They feel unique. He sort of drew on mythology for most of them. I don't know of hobbits outside of maybe a certain kind of fairy folk, but I think that was meant to be more of a symbolic idea of what, you know, sort of the country bumpkin in England was. The people who didn't live in the cities. But the thing that makes the races really interesting are, and whether you like it or not, is they're sort of divided usually between good and evil. Orcs and goblins are really a kind of an orc, I believe, but I love them both, so I split them up here. Trolls are really evil. Humans, dwarfs, elves are good for the most part. Ints are good. Spiders are bad. Wraiths are awesome. I mean, bad. But so you have a wide range of races, and each of them put their impact on the planet. They can be felt. If you walk into an area that spiders control, you know it, you fear them. They have an impact on the world beyond just being dressy places. Now, this is a really neat one. My wife and I played Lord of the Rings online for years, from beta through, we haven't played in a while, but we played it for a really long time, probably through about the time the Rise of Ran expansion came out. And we loved it to bits because like you could log on and you kind of felt like you're in these locations you read about. And that's one of the really neat things about Middle-earth is because of the level of detail he had in his world, you go into an area and it's like my favorite was just running around the Shire. And the Shire was a little bit more up, a little bit less dangerous. But, you know, it was about delivering pies. It was about day-to-day life of the Shire. and you could go see Bilbo's house. You could go do all of these things, and it was just really awesome going to the bridge to Brandywine to Bree for the first time, to Rivendell. So it's just such a rich, deep world, but with, places like the Misty Mountains or the Great Sea, which sort of is one of the borders that you don't know much beyond. And the Old Forest, obviously, with Tom Bombadil's house. The Gap of Rohan, the place you do not go if you want to go to Rohan. At least if you don't want to get caught going past Isengard. Moria, the giant mines, which are also a wonderful hunting zone for those levels if you're playing Lord of the Rings online. The Brandywine River, Mordor. I never got to Mordor, and I might pick the game back up at that point because it is free to play. But it was a wonderful game. It's just a question of time. But, it's just, these places felt real. It's like, I can imagine, seeing and smelling and tasting things in this world. And I don't get that a lot in other fiction. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, or to a different degree. But I think it was just, he had such depth of detail. And because really, for him it was about the languages, which we'll get to in a second. But it was just an incredibly rich world. And part of it was the races, but the places really felt real. Not necessarily always logical, but real. States, Mordor, Gondor, Rohan, Rivendell. I don't know if Rivendell is really a state, but you had some elves up in Mirkwood and places like that. You would have these areas, or Goblin Town. Oh, how could I forget Goblin Town? But you have these wonderful places that you can find. And there's, once again, a little bit more detail, and each of them sort of have their symbolic meanings back, but the cultures felt real. They didn't feel like specifically being English light, and I know Rohan is supposedly sort of, I believe, probably the Saxons or whatever, and Gondor's probably more like the Normans. I never noticed that reading the books. And obviously there's some symbology there, and the ruins, you think of the Norse, which had a huge influence on England too. But it's just this, once again, the states never felt quite. Actually, Rohan felt pretty good to me. The Shires I understood because of the hobbits. Really always felt like a sort of a free city. Rivendell, the same things were like old-fashioned city-states maybe. But, there was really just some wonderful interactions with sort of, these people who are supposedly all the free peoples of Middle-earth, the people who fight against evil, the good guys. But they have their struggles back and forth because they're not perfect either. Languages. When you talk about Middle-earth, you can't escape the languages. And there are several languages. There is, and I'm going to mispronounce all of these, except for Black Speech, Udnlail and Khaz'dul, Rorik, Westeron, and Valoran. And these were like 6 real languages that being a linguist he created. And those themselves help create continuity in the naming of the world. If you were in Rohan, you could feel it from the names. If you were around Gondor, you could feel it in the names. And the Shires were Shires. It all came through in the names of people and the names of locations. And it was the glue that held the cultures together, which is pretty good because if you think about it, it's language that holds our cultures together. It's because we have the same common words and that we envision the same things when we hear those sounds that make us think in many ways the same way. Not exactly, but a roundabout. Now, we might have different opinions on when we see that image, but we still see that same image. And that's something more than you would have if you did not understand someone at all. And I think language, probably more so than even religion, has an impact on why cultures sort of spring up and come together. Language is the culture that religion usually is the state, because you usually have a religion that sort of congeals around to create smaller states that then expand out to spread the religion or to protect the religion or whatever the reason is. Now, why does Middle-earth work for me? It's the devilishly good details. The songs, everything, and sometimes I didn't even enjoy reading them. But as a world, it really just bloomed in your mind. The map with the books, that really helped me. And I know Dean Frost is really good about inserting a map into her books. And some people are, and some people aren't, or they'll have less. But it was a pretty rich map in the version of the book I had. And then you could always find other more richer details. And today, there's a good one I linked to my show notes page from One Wicca to Rule Them All, which is the site where I looked up a lot of these names from, and I thank them immensely for having that wonderful site. There's also a link to that on my show notes page. But it was the map, so I could envision the world in my head, much the same way as I could envision Europe or Africa or Asia. Places I'd never been as a child, but places I could kind of envision because I could see, like geography, I could see where people lived, where people did not live, or at least in city-style abundance. The rich history, the first, second, and third age, and the remnants of different ages of the past coming into the present. The deep lore, the Silmarillion really kind of fleshed out a lot of the world in, I guess, short stories. But in a lot of what you see in the movies is sometimes more so from lore surrounding the books than actual stuff in the books. And the division of good versus evil. And I like that. I don't need all of my fiction that way. I generally don't think that way when I'm creating fiction, even though I like to give the appearance that I'm thinking that way. But usually the good versus evil thing, it's a perspective. If you could have done Lord of the Rings from the orcs' perspective, it might have seemed very similar. But they're trying to stop these evil bad guys from shoving this thing that can save the world into a little fiery pit. I'm sorry if I just ruined it. It's a spoiler. Oh, hint, pre-spoiler alert, or post-spoiler alert. The pre-spoiler alert would have been nicer. But I assume at this point, everyone knows the basic stories of the Lord of the Rings. There is no rating for this episode. I have no way of rating this episode. So, no rating. NA. The world building task for the day? Go to the show notes page and give me a memory of Middle-earth. Things you liked. Or if you want to say things you don't like, that's fine too. Like straight off the bat, if you had asked me, I'd say I wasn't fond of the way the stories were presented in the epic part of the Lord of the Rings. I didn't like it. I like the way it was done a bit better in the movies, where it's this back and forth between characters instead of, half the book being about Frodo and the other half being about the other guys. I didn't like that so much, but it didn't matter. They were still great reads. But just go to the show notes page on Gardul.com. That is GARDUL.com. Leave a comment of your memories of Middle-earth. A little detail that really stuck out in your mind that you always loved. Or big things that you loved from Middle-earth. Or things that maybe you thought could have been done better. Because, hey, it's the biggest fantasy thing of all time. I'm sure it could have been done better. And it will be at some point. And then people will have these same discussions about that. The real world task for the day. Okay, I was looking at this Forbes article called 9 Habits of Highly Productive People, and that's from the takeoff of a popular business book. I kind of like those as actual things to think about because as writers, we need to focus on productivity too, especially if you're working a day job. You got to have a plan for how you're attacking your week. The problem is, especially if you're an American, we are very skewed improperly on productivity. So the real world task for the day is take more breaks. When your brain starts to wander, take just a couple minutes, get up, exercise. Me, I smash my head on my desk for 2 minutes straight. My wife, will play one of those bubble games once and then get back to work. I find when I do that, I get a lot more work done in the evening. If I try not to do that, I sit in the computer more and I get less work done. And when you're like me and you work full time and are trying to write and are trying to podcast, sometimes writing gets thrown under the bus because as a writer, I love throwing my writing under the bus because, I'll get to that. I can get to that. I can get to that. I want to do that, so I'll get to that later. I'll get the things I don't want to get done first. And then I'll be too exhausted or my brain will be too dead when I get to the point of writing. The tease for the next episode is an interview with Philip E. Carroll. And as always, make sure to go to Gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.